Breaking news that's about to flip everything you thought you knew about the NBA on its head. New fight footage and insider testimonies have just surfaced, and I'm telling you right now, this isn't just another sports drama. What we're about to uncover is potentially one of the most calculated betrayals in professional basketball history, and it goes way deeper than a simple locker room scuffle. The October 5th, 2022 incident between Draymond Green and Jordan Poole? Yeah, forget everything you think you know about it, because what really happened behind those closed doors is absolutely insane. For over 2 years, the public has been fed a narrative. A simple story about two teammates getting heated during practice, emotions running high, and an unfortunate punch that got caught on camera. But what if I told you that recently resurfaced clips and explosive insider testimonies are painting a completely different picture? What if the most shocking part isn't what Draymond Green did, but what Steve Kerr allegedly orchestrated? Because according to these new revelations, we might be looking at one of the most devastating betrayals in NBA history. And it was masterminded by the person who was supposed to protect both players. The bombshell claim that's sending shockwaves through the basketball world? Steve Kerr didn't just fail to prevent this incident, he allegedly set it up. We're talking about a calculated manipulation where a coach deliberately positioned one of his players to get punched, knowing full well the explosive nature of his other player. This isn't about poor judgment or bad timing. This is about deliberate orchestration of psychological warfare that would ultimately destroy a championship dynasty from within. Hold on to your seats, because what we're about to dive into isn't just sports drama. It's a psychological thriller that involves systematic manipulation, toxic masculinity exploitation, and a betrayal so deep that it changed the trajectory of multiple careers and ended one of the most dominant runs in NBA history. The smoking gun evidence is finally here, and trust me, you're not ready for what we've uncovered. Let's rewind to November 2021, because this story doesn't start with a punch. It starts with a pattern. During a timeout against the Timberwolves, multiple witnesses report hearing Draymond Green issue verbal threats to Jordan Poole that were far more serious than anyone initially realized. We're talking about explicit language, with Green reportedly saying, "I'ma beat the shit out of you," during heated exchanges. This wasn't trash talk between teammates. This was genuine intimidation. And according to our sources, it was just the beginning of a systematic campaign of psychological abuse that would continue for months. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. Steve Kerr was reportedly aware of these escalating tensions. Multiple team insiders have come forward claiming that Kerr had documented evidence of Green's increasingly volatile behavior toward Poole throughout the 2021-2022 season and into the following preseason. Yet instead of addressing it, managing it, or protecting his younger player, Kerr allegedly began orchestrating what would become the most destructive moment in Warriors history. The manipulation really ramped up during the Warriors' 2022 preseason trip to Japan. This wasn't just a basketball tour. It became a psychological pressure cooker where Green publicly criticized Poole's performance, questioned his commitment, and challenged his readiness for a larger role. Team sources describe an environment where Green felt increasingly threatened by Poole's rising star power and contract negotiations, while Poole was desperately trying to prove himself worthy of veteran respect. And right in the middle of this toxic dynamic was Steve Kerr, apparently taking mental notes and formulating his plan. Now here's where this story takes a truly sinister turn. According to multiple witnesses in the days leading up to the October 5th practice, Kerr pulled Jordan Poole aside for what appeared to be a motivational conversation. But the content of this conversation is what's absolutely staggering. Kerr allegedly told Poole to stand up for yourself and be a man when dealing with Green's continued verbal aggression. Think about that for a second. A coach, someone who's supposed to protect his players, essentially programming a young athlete to confront a teammate known for explosive reactions. But wait, it gets even more twisted. Steve Kerr, has his own history. With being on the receiving end of a punch from a teammate, Michael Jordan famously hit Kerr during a 1995 practice. Kerr knows firsthand the psychological impact, the trauma, and the long-lasting effects of workplace violence in professional basketball. He experienced it himself, processed it, and understood exactly what it would do to a young player's psyche. Yet, according to these new revelations, he deliberately created the exact conditions that would inflict that same trauma on Jordan Poole. This isn't speculation. This is calculated psychological manipulation at its most cruel. Kerr understood both players' triggers perfectly. He knew Green's explosive nature, his insecurities about his role on the team, and his growing resentment toward Poole's rising status. He also knew Poole's vulnerabilities, his need for veteran approval, his desire to prove himself, and his growing confidence after strong preseason performances. And, like a master puppeteer, he allegedly pulled the exact strings needed to create an inevitable collision. The timeline reveals the cold calculation behind this manipulation. Jordan Poole had just come off a dominant scrimmage performance where he was feeling empowered and confident. Fresh off Kerr's advice to be a man and stand up for himself, Poole walked into that October 5th practice with a mindset that had been carefully cultivated by his own coach. When the moment came, when tensions reached their breaking point, Poole did exactly what Kerr had programmed him to do. He confronted Draymond Green. And that's when Jordan Poole delivered the insult that would change everything. Calling Draymond Green an expensive backpack for 30, a direct reference to Stephen Curry's jersey number. This wasn't random trash talk. This was a surgical strike aimed at Green's deepest insecurity about his role on the team. The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. Green's response was swift, violent, and exactly what Kerr allegedly knew would happen. Now, Draymond Green has denied parts of this story, posting 6 cap emojis on social media claiming the expensive backpack comment never happened. But here's the thing. Multiple independent sources are corroborating details that Green is trying to distance himself from. When someone with a history of explosive reactions starts selectively denying specific provocative statements while admitting to the physical violence, it raises serious questions about what really transpired and what's being covered up. The timing of this manipulation makes it even more sinister. This incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It occurred during one of the most delicate periods in both players' careers. Jordan Poole was on the verge of signing a massive contract extension that would establish him as a cornerstone of the franchise's future. Meanwhile, Draymond Green was facing his own contract uncertainties and growing questions about his long-term value to the organization. Kerr encouraged this confrontation when both players were at their most psychologically vulnerable, when emotions were running highest, and when the stakes couldn't have been more personal or professional. Think about the level of psychological understanding this required. Kerr had to know that calling Green an expensive backpack would hit him where it hurt most: his pride, his identity, his sense of contribution to the team's success. Green has always been sensitive about recognition, about being seen as more than just a role player riding Stephen Curry's coattails. Kerr understood these insecurities intimately, and according to these revelations, he weaponized them against his own player. The manipulation goes even deeper when you consider how Kerr positioned himself throughout this process. He became the voice in Poole's ear, encouraging him to be a man, to stand up for himself, to not back down from confrontation. Meanwhile, he was simultaneously managing Green's volatile personality and growing resentment. Kerr was playing both sides, creating the perfect storm of toxic masculinity and competitive pride that would inevitably explode. What makes this betrayal particularly devastating is the trust factor. Players trust their coaches to protect them, to guide them, to put their well-being above all else. Jordan Poole trusted Steve Kerr's advice, believed his coach had his best interests at heart, and followed that guidance directly into a nightmare scenario that would traumatize him and derail his career trajectory. Draymond Green, meanwhile, was being managed by someone who apparently understood his triggers well enough to manipulate them for unknown purposes. The psychological aftermath reveals the true depth of damage this manipulation caused. When TMZ released that practice footage on October 7, 2022, it didn't just expose a fight. It revealed a toxic environment that had been festering underneath the Warriors' championship culture. The video showed the world that this perfect, joy-filled organization was actually riddled with resentment, manipulation, and systematic psychological abuse. Draymond Green's immediate response to the video leak was telling. Instead of showing genuine remorse for physically assaulting a teammate, Green seemed more upset about the public exposure than the actual violence. His apologies carried undertones of defiance, suggesting he felt more wronged by the leak than wrong about his actions. This victim mentality revealed someone who had been so systematically manipulated that he couldn't even recognize the severity of his own behavior. Meanwhile, Jordan Poole was left to process this trauma in complete isolation. While Green was playing the victim about public scrutiny, Poole was dealing with the reality of being physically assaulted by a teammate, betrayed by his coach, and then expected to simply move on as if nothing happened. The organization's response, fining Green rather than suspending him, sent a clear message that championship aspirations mattered more than player safety and basic human decency. The season that followed became a psychological minefield. Every interaction between Green and Poole was scrutinized for signs of lingering resentment. Every timeout, every team meeting, every practice session carried the weight of unresolved trauma and manipulation. The Warriors' trademark joy and chemistry became forced and artificial, replaced by an undercurrent of toxicity that poisoned everything they tried to accomplish. Jordan Poole showed incredible grace under impossible circumstances. His public response of "We're here to win a championship" demonstrated maturity far beyond his years, but it also revealed the impossible position he'd been placed in. He was expected to coexist professionally with someone who had physically assaulted him, to trust teammates who had enabled that assault, and to perform at an elite level while processing profound betrayal from his own coaching staff. The psychological warfare continued even after the punch. Green's pattern of "dialogue happens over time" comments showed his recognition that his behavior toward Poole had been escalating for months, but also revealed his inability to understand the trauma he had inflicted. When someone has been systematically abused and then physically assaulted, they don't just move on because the aggressor decides it's time to heal. Healing doesn't work on the aggressor's timeline. What's particularly heartbreaking is how this manipulation exploited fundamental aspects of competitive sports culture. The emphasis on toughness, on standing up for yourself, on proving your manhood, these aren't inherently toxic concepts, but they become weapons when manipulated by someone in a position of authority. Kerr allegedly took these cultural elements and weaponized them to create a scenario where violence became inevitable. The broader implications of this systematic manipulation extend far beyond basketball. We're looking at how authority figures can weaponize team dynamics, how toxic masculinity can be exploited for unknown agendas, and how organizational cultures can become breeding grounds for psychological abuse. The Warriors weren't just a basketball team. They were a case study in how power can be abused within professional environments. Draymond Green's later admissions about feeling manipulated at ages 33 to 35 are particularly revealing. These statements suggest that even Green recognizes he was being managed and potentially manipulated during this period. A veteran player with over a decade of NBA experience doesn't typically admit to being manipulated unless the manipulation was sophisticated and systematic. This isn't about being young and naive. This is about being strategically positioned by someone who understood psychological triggers at an expert level. The contract negotiation timing makes this manipulation even more calculated. Both Poole and Green were facing career-defining decisions about their futures with the organization. Poole was about to secure generational wealth and establish himself as a franchise cornerstone. Green was fighting for his own financial security and team relevance. These weren't just emotional vulnerabilities. They were economic and professional, pressure points that Kerr allegedly exploited. The championship window consequences reveal the true cost of this betrayal. The Warriors had assembled one of the most talented rosters in NBA history, with multiple Hall of Fame players in their prime and a supporting cast built for sustained excellence. This team should have competed for championships for years to come. Instead, a single moment of calculated manipulation destroyed the chemistry, trust, and cultural foundation that made their success possible. Jordan Poole's subsequent career trajectory shows the lasting impact of this trauma. Despite signing a massive extension, his performance suffered dramatically. He went from being a rising star and potential franchise player to someone who struggled to find his rhythm and confidence. The psychological impact of betrayal, not just from Green, but from the entire organizational structure that enabled and encouraged the confrontation, fundamentally changed his relationship with basketball and competition. The trade to Washington became inevitable once it became clear that true reconciliation wasn't possible. Poole couldn't heal and grow within the same environment where he'd been systematically manipulated and ultimately assaulted. The Warriors were forced to give up a young, talented player with massive potential because they had created a toxic environment that made his continued presence impossible. Steve Kerr's motivations remain mysterious, and that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire saga. What agenda was worth deliberately engineering the destruction of team chemistry? What goal justified manipulating two players into a confrontation that would traumatize one and potentially end both their careers with the organization? Was it about contract negotiations, power dynamics, or simply catastrophically poor judgment dressed up as tough love? The organizational response revealed priorities that should concern every NBA fan. By choosing to fine rather than suspend Green, by pushing for quick reconciliation rather than genuine healing, by prioritizing championship aspirations over basic player safety, the Warriors showed that their values were fundamentally corrupted. The strength in numbers philosophy became a cruel irony as those numbers systematically dwindled due to internal toxicity. What makes this story even more tragic is how preventable it all was. Proper leadership, genuine conflict resolution, and basic human decency could have addressed the underlying tensions without anyone getting hurt. Instead, we got systematic manipulation that exploited competitive culture and masculine insecurities to create inevitable violence. The Warriors didn't just lose a talented young player, they lost their moral authority and cultural identity. The psychological profiles that enabled this manipulation are fascinating and terrifying. Kerr understood that Green's triggers included challenges to his authority, questions about his team value, and suggestions that he was riding Stephen Curry's coattails. He also understood that Poole's vulnerabilities included his need for veteran respect, his desire to prove himself worthy of his emerging role, and his growing confidence that could be weaponized against more established players. By positioning himself as the voice encouraging Poole to be a man and stand up for himself, Kerr created a scenario where toxic masculinity and competitive pride were on a collision course. He turned healthy competitive drive into psychological warfare, transforming team chemistry into a weapon that would ultimately destroy the very culture he was supposed to protect. The aftermath continues to reveal new layers of damage. Green's recent admissions about not properly celebrating Poole's contract extension show growing awareness of how his actions affected someone who should have been a cherished teammate. His January 2025 pleas for everyone to move on suggest recognition that the wounds he inflicted, and that were inflicted upon him through systematic manipulation, continue to fester and spread. But perhaps the most telling aspect of this entire saga is how it reveals the difference between accountability and healing. Green has repeatedly apologized, acknowledged his mistakes, and expressed regret about his actions. Yet, true healing requires more than apologies. It requires acknowledgement of the systematic manipulation that created the conditions for violence, recognition of the ongoing trauma inflicted on the victim, and fundamental changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. Jordan Poole's journey since leaving the Warriors demonstrates both resilience and the lasting impact of organizational betrayal. Finding success in Washington as a focal point player shows his talent was never the issue. The toxic environment in Golden State was what prevented him from reaching his potential. His ability to rebuild his confidence and performance in a healthier organizational culture proves that the problems were systemic, not individual. The question of reconciliation remains complex and painful. Can Draymond Green truly heal from being manipulated into destroying a relationship with someone who should have been like a younger brother? Can Jordan Poole ever fully trust again after being systematically set up by people who were supposed to protect him? These aren't just basketball questions. They're fundamental questions about trauma, healing, and the possibility of redemption after profound betrayal. The broader implications extend far beyond the NBA. This story serves as a cautionary tale about how authority figures can weaponize competitive environments, how toxic culture can be disguised as championship mentality, and how psychological manipulation can destroy both individuals and organizations. Every coach, every leader, every person in a position of authority should study this saga as an example of how power can be abused and trust can be shattered through calculated manipulation. The most devastating aspect of this entire story might be how unnecessary it all was. The Warriors had everything: talent, chemistry, championship experience, and organizational stability. They were positioned for sustained excellence and multiple championships. Instead, a moment of calculated manipulation destroyed all of that potential, scattered their talent across the league, and ended one of the most dominant dynasties in professional sports history. The human cost cannot be understated. Jordan Poole went from being a beloved rising star to someone carrying trauma that affected his performance and confidence. Draymond Green went from being an emotional leader to someone whose reputation may never fully recover from this incident. Steve Kerr went from being seen as a player's coach and cultural architect to someone whose leadership judgment is now fundamentally questioned. The organizational cost was equally devastating. The Warriors went from being viewed as the gold standard for team culture and player development to being seen as an environment where systematic manipulation and psychological abuse could flourish under the guise of championship culture. Their strength in numbers philosophy became a haunting reminder of how quickly organizational values can be corrupted when leadership fails. Looking back at this saga with the benefit of hindsight and new evidence, we can see how every element was perfectly orchestrated for maximum damage. The timing during contract negotiations, the psychological manipulation exploiting masculine insecurities, the deliberate encouragement of confrontation, and the subsequent organizational response that prioritized championships over human dignity. It all points to a level of calculated betrayal that's almost impossible to comprehend. The most chilling aspect is how this manipulation exploited the very qualities that make athletes great: competitive drive, desire for respect, willingness to stand up for yourself. These are positive traits that become destructive when weaponized by someone who understands how to exploit them. Kerr allegedly turned Poole's growth mindset against him and Green's competitive fire into a weapon of destruction. As we process these new revelations about one of the most shocking incidents in recent NBA history, we're left with profound questions about trust, leadership, and the true cost of winning at all costs. The October 5, 2022 incident wasn't just a moment of lost control. It was apparently the culmination of months of systematic manipulation designed to create exactly the explosive confrontation that would destroy a dynasty from within. The legacy of this betrayal continues to unfold. Both Draymond Green and Jordan Poole are still processing the long-term consequences of being manipulated into a confrontation that changed their lives forever. The Warriors are still dealing with the cultural damage and missed opportunities that resulted from this calculated destruction of team chemistry. And Steve Kerr's reputation as a leader and protector of players has been fundamentally altered by these revelations about his alleged role in orchestrating one of the most devastating moments in NBA history. This story serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the most damaging betrayals come not from enemies, but from those we trust most. In professional sports, as in life, the people in positions of authority have the power to build up or tear down those under their care. When that power is used for manipulation rather than protection, the consequences extend far beyond any individual incident. They poison entire cultures and destroy the very foundations of trust that make excellence possible. The truth about October 5th, 2022 is finally emerging, and it's more shocking than anyone could have imagined.